The wedding ring slipped from her cold fingers as the preacher closed the good book. 3 days, that's all she'd asked for. Just enough time to give her daughter a name worth having. But as Jacob Thornton knelt beside the shallow grave, he dug with his own hands, watching little Mary clutch her mother's Bible. He realized this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something that would test every fiber of faith he had left. Because in the distance, dust clouds were rising, and the men who'd been hunting Catherine were finally coming to collect what they believed was theirs. Jacob Thornton's ranch sat like a forgotten prayer, in the middle of nowhere, just a weathered cabin, a dying well, and graves that outnumbered the living. The morning wind carried the scent of sage and regret across the empty corral where his horses used to run. 3 years since the fever took Martha and little Samuel, and he'd been talking to ghosts ever since. The sound of his coffee cup hitting the wooden table was the only conversation he'd had in weeks. Out here in the Colorado Territory, silence was God's way of reminding a man how small he really was. Jacob stared at the black liquid, watching steam curl up like the prayers he'd stopped saying. "Morning, Martha," he whispered to the empty chair across from him. The words felt heavy as lead in his mouth. Samuel would have been 10 today. The silence answered back, that kind of silence that only death brings. It settled into his bones like winter cold, making him feel older than his 34 years. He'd stopped shaving regular, stopped caring if his clothes were clean. What was the point when nobody was left to see? Outside, the cemetery plot behind his cabin held two wooden crosses, one tall, one small. He'd carved them both with hands that shook from grief more than whiskey. The fever had taken them both in the same week, and he'd been helpless to stop it. A man who could break a wild horse couldn't break death's grip on the people he loved most. "I failed them, Lord," he whispered to the empty sky, his voice cracking like dried leather. What kind of man can't protect his own family? The guilt ate at him worse than hunger. Every night, he heard their voices in the wind, Martha calling his name from the kitchen, Samuel's laughter echoing from the barn. He'd stopped going to church, stopped praying, stopped believing that God heard anything but his own silence. His hands shook as he poured another cup of coffee, the same hands that had dug 2 graves in ground so hard it took him 3 days to finish. The same hands that had held his wife as she burned with fever, promising her everything would be all right when they both knew it was a lie. The sound of distant hoofbeats made him look up from his bitter thoughts. A wagon was coming across the prairie, listing to one side like a dying animal. Jacob grabbed his rifle out of habit. In this territory, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news, but as the wagon drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he had the sinking feeling that his days of talking to ghosts were about to come to an end. Before we continue this emotional story, put in the comments below which city you're watching from. It'll be a pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now, let's continue this exciting story. The wagon appeared like a mirage through the heat shimmer, lurching forward on 3 wheels and a prayer. Jacob squinted against the sun, his finger resting on his rifle's trigger. The driver was slumped over the reins, barely conscious, while beside her sat a small figure that made his chest tighten with unexpected recognition. A child, a little girl with dark hair and eyes too old for her face. As the wagon finally rolled to a stop in his yard, Jacob got his first clear look at its passengers. The woman driving couldn't have been more than 22, but her face was gray as winter ash, blood staining the front of her worn dress. Consumption. By the look of it, he'd seen enough death to recognize its calling cards. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "I'm dying, and they're coming. For us. My daughter, she needs a name. A good name." The little girl clutched a rag doll, like it was her last hope in this world. She looked at Jacob with eyes that reminded him painfully of Samuel, that mixture of fear and desperate trust that children wore when the world had shown them too much cruelty too soon. "Ma'am," Jacob said, lowering his rifle, "you need to get inside, both of you." The woman tried to stand, but collapsed back onto the wagon seat, coughing up blood onto her hand. The little girl, Mary, she'd said her name was Mary, reached for her mother with small hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Mama." The child's voice was barely a whisper. Jacob didn't think. He stepped forward and lifted the woman in his arms, surprised by how light she was, all bones and fever, like holding a bundle of kindling. The child followed, her doll trailing in the dust behind her. Inside the cabin, he laid the woman on his bed, the same bed where Martha had died 3 years ago. For a moment, the past and present collided so hard he could barely breathe. But the woman's eyes were fixed on his face with desperate intensity. "My name is Catherine Wells," she said, each word a struggle. "This is my daughter, Mary." Her father His family. She dissolved into another coughing fit, more blood spotting the quilt. Take your time, Jacob said, though something in her tone told him time was the one thing they didn't have. His family wants us dead, Catherine whispered when she could speak again. Wants to erase us like we never existed. Mary's illegitimate, you see. Bad for their precious reputation. The little girl stood by the window, watching the horizon with the wariness of someone who'd learned to fear what might be coming. Jacob's heart clenched as he watched her so young, so scared, so alone. How long have you been running? He asked. Weeks. Maybe months. Time blurs when you're dying. Catherine's hand found his wrist with surprising strength. I don't have long. Mr. Thornton. Jacob Thornton. Mr. Thornton, I need to ask something terrible of you. Something that ain't fair to ask a stranger. Her eyes burned with fever and desperation. I need you to marry me. The words hit him, like a physical blow. Ma'am, 3 days, that's all I'm asking for. Just long enough to make Mary legitimate. To give her a name that means something instead of being called a bastard her whole life. Tears tracked down Catherine's wasted cheeks. I know it's a lot to ask, but she's good, Mr. Thornton. She's innocent in all this. And if you don't help us, there won't be anywhere left to run. Jacob stared at this dying woman and her terrified child, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the cold emptiness of grief. It was anger pure, righteous anger at a world that would hunt down a sick woman and an innocent child for the sake of family reputation. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers. And in that wind, Jacob could swear. He heard Martha's voice. We are our brother's keeper. Jacob, when the world shows no mercy, we must show mercy ourselves. But even as he opened his mouth to answer, the sound of distant riders made them all freeze. 3 men on horseback had appeared on the horizon, and they were riding hard toward the cabin. Catherine's face went white as bone. They found us, she whispered. The riders came at sunset, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth like death's own heartbeat. Jacob watched from his window as they approached 3 men, with the kind of easy violence that money could buy. He'd seen their type before. Men who did the dirty work for wealthy families. Men who cleaned up problems and asked no questions about right or wrong. The leader dismounted with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. He was a scarred man with dead eyes, the kind of man who killed for wages and slept sound afterward. Thornton, he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Name's Pike. We're looking for a woman and her brat. Heard they might have stopped by. Jacob stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, but not yet raised. Inside, he could hear Catherine trying to muffle her coughing, while Mary pressed herself against the far wall. The child's fear was so thick you could taste it in the air. Don't know what you're talking about, Jacob said, his voice steady, despite the hammering of his heart. Pike's smile was all teeth and malice. Now, that's disappointing. Thornton, see, Mr. Marcus Whitmore's real particular about cleaning up family messes. That woman and her little mistake stole something that don't belong to them. What did they steal? His grandson's good name. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. These men weren't here to talk or negotiate. They were here to erase Catherine and Mary from existence. To make sure Marcus Whitmore's precious family reputation stayed untarnished by the inconvenience of an illegitimate grandchild. Funny thing about names, Jacob said, his grip tightening on his rifle. I always figured they belonged to whoever carried them. Pike's laugh was like gravel in a tin cup. You got a sense of humor, Thornton. I appreciate that in a man. Makes this easier somehow. He gestured to his companions, both of whom had their hands resting on their gun butts. Now, we can do this easy or hard. Your choice. I told you. And I'm telling you, that woman's dying anyway. Consumption's got her. Good. Won't last another week. Maybe 2 if she's stubborn. All we want is the kid. Save everyone a lot of trouble. Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. These men talked about Mary like she was livestock to be collected. Not a frightened child who'd already lost everything that mattered. What's a rich man like Whitmore want with one little girl? Pike spat in the dust. Don't want her. Wants her gone. Permanently. Can't have her growing up to make claims on the family fortune, can we? Bad for business. The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather, made Jacob's blood turn to ice. They meant to kill her. A child who couldn't even defend herself. Well, Jacob said, raising his rifle just enough to be noticed. I'm afraid you boys are out of luck. Ain't seen no woman and child around these parts. Pike's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. That's unfortunate, Thornton, because we tracked them right to your door. Their wagons sitting in your yard with a broken wheel and blood on the seat. Inside the cabin, Jacob heard a soft sound, Murray crying, trying to be quiet but failing. Pike heard it too. His smile widened. Sounds like you got company after all. The other two men spread out, flanking the cabin. Professional killers, every one of them. Jacob realized with crystal clarity that if he didn't think fast, all three of them would be dead before morning. Tell you what, Pike continued, his hand now resting openly on his gun. You hand them over peaceful like, and we'll let you live. Hell, we might even pay you for your trouble. Mr. Whitmore's generous with folks who help him solve problems. Jacob thought of Catherine inside, dying by inches but still fighting to protect her daughter. He thought of Mary, clutching her doll and trying not to cry. He thought of Martha and Samuel, buried out back, and how he'd failed to protect them when it mattered most. But this time was different. This time, he had a choice. I got a counteroffer, Jacob said, his voice deadly quiet. You boys turn around and ride out of here while you still can. Pike's laugh died in his throat. You threatening us, Thornton? No, Jacob replied, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something like purpose flowing through his veins. I'm making you a promise. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Jacob wondered if Martha could see him from wherever she'd gone. He hoped she'd understand what he was about to do, because for the first time since he'd buried his family, Jacob Thornton had something worth fighting for. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Pike's eyes never left Jacob's face, measuring, calculating. Professional killers learn to read men the way preachers read scripture. And whatever Pike saw in Jacob's expression made him reconsider his approach. You're making a mistake, Thornton, Pike said finally, but he made no move for his gun. Not yet. Mr. Whitmore's got a long reach and longer memory. This ain't over. Maybe not, Jacob replied, but it's over for tonight. Pike gestured to his men, and they backed toward their horses with the practiced ease of predators retreating to hunt another day. 24 hours. Thornton, think it over. Tomorrow night, we're coming back, and we won't be asking polite. They mounted up and rode into the gathering darkness, but Jacob knew they wouldn't go far. Men like Pike didn't give up easy when money was involved. They'd camp somewhere within sight of the cabin and wait for him to make a mistake. Inside, he found Catherine sitting up in bed, her face flushed with fever but her eyes bright with determination. Mary sat beside her mother, still clutching her doll, but she looked at Jacob with something new in her expression, a fragile, tentative hope. They'll be back, Catherine said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow night, most likely. Jacob set his rifle by the door and pulled up a chair. Which means we don't have much time. Time for what? Jacob looked at this dying woman and her frightened child and made the hardest decision of his life. To get married. Catherine's eyes widened. Mr. Thornton, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. That little girl needs a name and protection. I got both to give. But why? You don't know us, don't owe us nothing. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, thinking about graves and ghosts and chances to do right when life had gone so wrong. My wife and son died 3 years ago. Fever took them both, and there wasn't nothing I could do to stop it. His voice cracked slightly. I couldn't save them, Mrs. Wells. But maybe I can save you too. Catherine reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold despite the fever burning in her. You'd really do this? For strangers? You ain't strangers anymore, Jacob said simply. The moment you asked for help, you became my responsibility. Mary spoke for the first time since they'd come inside, her voice barely a whisper. What's your name? I mean, your whole name. Jacob Samuel Thornton, he replied, surprised by the question. The little girl considered this seriously. That's a good name, better than Wells. Despite everything, Jacob found himself smiling. Mary Thornton's got a nice ring to it. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, she corrected solemnly. Elizabeth was my grandmother's name. Mama told me stories about her. Catherine squeezed Jacob's hand tighter. Are you sure about this, Mr. Thornton? Once those men find out what we've done, they'll have to go through me to get to her, Jacob said, and he meant every word. I already buried one family. I ain't burying another. That night, as Catherine's fever burned higher and Mary slept fitfully on a blanket by the fireplace, Jacob knelt beside his wife's grave in the moonlight. The wooden cross cast a long shadow across the prairie grass. Martha, he whispered, his voice carrying on the wind. I know this ain't what we planned. No, you'd probably have words for me about bringing strangers into our home. He pulled out his wedding ring, the one he'd worn for 7 years. The the one that had been cold against his finger for 3 years, but that little girl in there, she's got your eyes. Somehow. And her mama's fighting for her life, just like you fought for Samuel. The gold caught the moonlight like a promise. Jacob closed his eyes and tried to feel Martha's presence. Tried to hear her voice in the wind. For a moment, he could almost imagine her standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder. I'm gonna marry her, Martha. Give that child a name she can be proud of. I know it ain't love, not like what we had, but it's right. And I think you'd understand. The wind picked up, rustling through the grass with a sound like whispered approval. For the first time in 3 years, Jacob Thornton prayed, not for forgiveness, not for answers, but for strength to do what was right, even if it killed him. Because tomorrow, he was going to become a husband again. And if Pike and his men wanted to take his new family away, they'd have to kill him first. Inside the cabin, Catherine coughed herself awake and looked toward the window where Jacob knelt by the graves. She understood what he was doing out there, saying goodbye to his past so he could protect her future. The weight of his sacrifice settled on her like a blanket, heavy with gratitude and sorrow. Mary stood beside the fireplace, mumbling something. In her sleep, Catherine listened closely and heard the words that broke her heart. Don't leave me, Mama. Please don't leave me. But now, maybe she wouldn't have to. Now, maybe her daughter would have someone left when the consumption finally won its battle. In the morning, she would marry Jacob Thornton. And if God was merciful, she'd live long enough to see her daughter safe. Dawn broke gray and cold across the prairie, matching the color of Catherine's face as she struggled to sit up in bed. The fever had worsened during the night, and Jacob could see death moving closer with each labored breath she took. But her eyes were clear and determined when she looked at him. We need to do this now, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, before I'm too weak to say the words. Jacob had sent word to Pastor Henderson in the early hours, asking him to come quickly. The old preacher arrived just after sunrise, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in the scene: a dying woman, a frightened child, and a man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jacob, Pastor Henderson said quietly, pulling him aside. You sure about this? Marriage is a sacred covenant, not something to enter lightly. Sure as I've ever been about anything, Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging. In his heart, that little girl needs protection, and this is the only way to give it to her legally. Mary stood beside the bed, holding her mother's hand with fierce determination. She'd brushed her hair neat and put on her cleanest dress, understanding somehow that this was a moment that would change everything. Her young face carried a gravity that broke Jacob's heart. No child should have to grow up so fast. Pastor Henderson opened his worn Bible, the pages fluttering in the morning breeze from the open window. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate instituted by God himself. Catherine tried to sit up straighter, and Jacob gently helped her, careful not to jar her fragile frame. She wore a simple blue dress, the only decent one she owned, and, though it hung loose on her wasted form, there was dignity in her bearing that spoke of inner strength. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly or carelessly, but reverently, and in the fear of God, Pastor Henderson continued, his voice carrying the weight of years spent presiding over life's most sacred moments. Into this holy estate, these two persons come now to be joined. The ceremony was simple and heartbreaking. Catherine's voice was so weak that Jacob had to lean close to hear her vows. But every word carried the weight of desperate hope and profound gratitude. Do you, Jacob Samuel Thornton, take Catherine Elizabeth Wells to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, till death do you part? Jacob looked into Catherine's fevered eyes and saw, not just a dying woman, but a mother fighting with her last breath to secure her daughter's future. I do, he said, his voice strong and clear, echoing off the cabin walls like a vow to heaven itself. Do you, Catherine Elizabeth Wells, take Jacob Samuel Thornton to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, till death do you part? Catherine's eyes found Mary's face first, drinking in her daughter's features as if memorizing them, then returned to Jacob's weathered countenance. A single tear traced down her cheek as she whispered, I do. When it came time for rings, Jacob realized they had none. Then, with trembling fingers, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band, his own wedding ring from Martha. It had sat cold in a drawer for 3 years, but now it would serve another sacred purpose. With this ring, I thee wed, he said, slipping it onto Catherine's thin finger. The medal was warm from his pocket, and it fit her perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Pastor Henderson's voice grew solemn as he spoke the final words. By the power vested in me by God Almighty and the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. But as the preacher pronounced them married, Catherine whispered something that stopped Jacob's heart cold. Her lips barely moved, but he caught the words. My maiden name was Martha Catherine Wells. Martha was my sister. The world tilted on its axis. Martha had mentioned a sister who'd run away years ago, but Jacob had never connected the dots. Now he understood why Mary's eyes seemed so familiar, why Catherine's smile reminded him painfully of his dead wife. This wasn't just about protecting strangers, he was protecting his own family, blood of his blood. Before he could fully process this revelation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the sacred moment. Through the window, Jacob could see riders cresting the hill pike and his men, returning just as they'd promised. But earlier than expected, Catherine's hand found his with surprising strength, her fingers icy despite the fever. They can't take her now, she whispered urgently. She's legitimate. She has your name. Mrs. Thornton, Pastor Henderson said, using her new title with gentle respect. You need to rest. This excitement isn't good for your condition. But Catherine was already struggling to sit up, maternal instinct overriding her body's weakness. Mary, she called to her daughter, her voice gaining strength from desperation. Come here, sweetheart. The little girl approached the bed, her rag doll clutched tightly against her chest. Catherine took her daughter's face in her hands, memorizing every detail, the dark curls that caught the morning light, the serious brown eyes that held too much understanding for such a young face. You remember what I told you about being brave? Catherine's voice was growing weaker, but her love was fierce and unwavering, about how sometimes God asks us to be stronger than we think we can be. Mary nodded solemnly, tears threatening to spill over. Your papa Jacob is going to take care of you now. You mind him, you hear? And you remember that you're Mary Elizabeth Thornton, and that's a name to be proud of. Don't let nobody tell you different. Outside, the hoofbeats grew closer, and Jacob could hear Pike's voice calling out across the yard. The reckoning he'd known was coming had finally arrived, and his new family, fragile as it was hung in the balance. Catherine's eyes met his one last time, and in them he saw not fear, but profound gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for giving her what I couldn't. A name, a future, a chance at life without shame. As Pike's voice grew louder outside, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the fierce, protective love of a father ready to defend his child. Mary was his daughter now, in the eyes of God and the law, and he'd be buried in the ground before he'd let anyone take her away. The wedding was over. Now the real fight would begin. Pike's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. Thornton, we know you're in there. Time's up. Jacob moved to the window, his rifle in hand, watching as the 3 men spread out around his cabin with practiced precision. They'd brought extra ammunition. This time he could see the loaded gun belts and the cold determination in their eyes. These weren't men who planned to leave empty-handed again. Stay with your mama, Jacob whispered to Mary, who pressed herself against Catherine's side on the bed. The little girl's face was pale with terror, but she nodded bravely, clutching her rag doll like a shield against the evil closing in around them. Pastor Henderson stood frozen in the center of the cabin, his Bible still open in his trembling hands. Jacob, perhaps we should reason with them. Surely they won't harm a dying woman and a child. Pastor, Jacob said quietly, never taking his eyes off Pike. You don't know these men. Reason ain't in their vocabulary. Catherine struggled to sit up despite her weakness, her new wedding ring catching the morning light. Jacob, she whispered urgently, there's something else I need to tell you. About Martha. About why I ran away all those years ago. But Pike's voice boomed across the yard again, cutting off her words. Mrs. Wells, I know you can hear me. Mr. Whitmore is prepared to be generous. He'll pay for a nice funeral. Make sure you're buried proper-like. All you've got to do is send the girl out. Catherine's face went ashen, but her jaw set with fierce determination. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, she called out, her voice carrying despite its weakness. My daughter is Mary Elizabeth Thornton now, legally wed to this good man's family. She ain't going nowhere with you. The silence that followed was more terrifying than shouting. Jacob could see Pike's face through the window, and the cold fury there made his blood run cold. These men had expected to collect their prize without opposition. Now they faced a legal marriage that complicated everything. That's so, Pike finally called back. Well, that's real touching. But marriage certificates can burn just as easy as everything else. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Pike gesture to his men. One of them was already moving toward the barn where Jacob kept his hay stores. The message was clear. They'd burn him out if necessary. "Catherine," Jacob said urgently, "what were you trying to tell me about Martha?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Mary, then back at Jacob. Martha didn't just have a sister who ran away. She had a sister who was... Her voice broke. Who was attacked by Marcus Whitmore himself when she was just 16. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. He stared at Catherine's face. He could see it now in the bone structure. The shape of her eyes, and understood with horrible clarity why she'd run. Why she'd ended up unmarried and pregnant. Why Marcus Whitmore wanted her and her daughter erased from existence. "Mary is his granddaughter," Catherine whispered. "His blood, and he knows it. That's why he can't let her live to grow up and make claims on his fortune." Jacob's hands shook as the full horror of the situation crashed over him. This wasn't just about family reputation. This was about a powerful man trying to bury his crimes by destroying the evidence. A child, an innocent little girl who carried his blood. Papa Jacob. Mary's small voice cut through his thoughts. She was looking at him with complete trust, as if he could somehow make everything right in her world that had gone so terribly wrong. "It's gonna be okay, sweetheart," he said, though his voice cracked with the weight of the promise. How could he protect her against men with money, power, and no conscience? Outside, smoke began to rise from the direction of the barn. Pike's man had lit the hay, and now flames were licking at the wooden walls. The threat was clear. The child will watch everything burn. Catherine gripped Jacob's hand with the last of her strength. "There's a reason God brought me to you," she whispered. "Martha always said you were the most honorable man she'd ever known. She said you'd die before you'd let harm come to family. Catherine, you need to save your strength." "No," she interrupted, her voice growing urgent as the smell of smoke began to drift through the cabin. "Listen to me. In my wagon, under the loose board in the floor, there's a letter from Marcus Whitmore. It admits what he did to me, threatens me if I ever tell anyone. It's proof, Jacob. Legal proof of what kind of man he really is." Jacob's mind raced. A confession letter could change everything, if he could get it to the right authorities. But first, he had to keep them all alive long enough to use it. Pastor Henderson had gone pale as bone. "Jacob, the barn's catching fast. The wind's picking up. If those flames spread to the cabin..." Mary began to cry softly, and Catherine pulled her close with arms that shook from fever and fear. "Baby girl. Papa Jacob's gonna take care of us. Just like he promised." But Jacob could see the truth in Catherine's eyes. She was dying, maybe had hours left at most. The fever was consuming her from the inside, and the stress of the situation was making it worse. If he was going to save Mary, he had to act fast. "Pike," Jacob called out the window. "You want to talk terms? Let's talk." "No terms, Thornton. Send out the girl, and maybe we'll let you and the preacher walk away." Jacob looked at Mary, his daughter now, in every way that mattered and felt, something he hadn't experienced since Martha and Samuel died. Pure, protective fury. The kind of righteous anger that gave ordinary men extraordinary courage. "I got a counter proposal," he shouted back. "You boys ride out now, and I won't have to dig 3 more graves." Pike's laughter carried on the wind, cruel and mocking. Big talk from a man whose barn's already burning. But Jacob wasn't backing down. Not this time. Not when an innocent child's life hung in the balance. He looked at Catherine, at Mary, at Pastor Henderson's terrified face, and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. "Pastor," he said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. Take Mary and get to that wagon. Find that letter Catherine mentioned. And if things go bad, ... double quotes, he swallowed hard. If things go bad, you get her out of here. Take her to the sheriff, in town. Tell him everything. Jacob, I can't leave you. You can, and you will," Jacob said firmly. "That little girl's counting on us to keep her safe. That's our job now." Outside, the flames grew higher, and Pike's voice echoed across the prairie like a death sentence. But inside the cabin, a dying woman held her daughter close and whispered a prayer that someone, somewhere, would have the courage to stand against evil when it came calling. And Jacob Thornton, a man who'd lost everything once before, prepared to risk it all again for the chance to save what mattered most. The smoke from the burning barn grew thicker, seeping through the cabin walls like the breath of death itself. Jacob watched Pastor Henderson carefully lift Mary into his arms, the little girl's face buried against his shoulder as silent tears soaked through his shirt. She understood, even at 8 years old, that everything was about to change forever. "The wagon's behind the cabin," Catherine whispered. each word a struggle against the fever consuming her. Under the loose board, near the front wheel, the letters wrapped in OILCLOTH ... Marcus Whitmore's own handwriting. Threatens to have me eliminated if I ever tell anyone what he did. Jacob helped Pastor Henderson toward the back door, his heart breaking as he watched Mary reach out for her mother one last time. Catherine managed to lift a hand, touching her daughter's cheek with trembling fingers. "Be brave, my angel," Catherine whispered. "Remember, ... you're a Thornton now. That means something. Means you belong to a good man, who'll protect you with his life." Pastor Henderson's voice shook as he spoke. "Catherine, I'll pray for your healing. God can work miracles. Pray for Mary instead." Catherine interrupted, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. "Pray she grows up, knowing she was loved more than life itself." The sound of approaching footsteps on the front porch cut through their goodbyes. Pike's patience had run out, and Jacob could hear him testing the door handle. Time was up. "Go," Jacob whispered urgently. "Now." Pastor Henderson slipped out the back door with Mary, disappearing into the morning shadows. As Jacob positioned himself by the front window, through the glass, he could see Pike's scarred face, twisted with cold determination. This was a man who'd killed before, and felt nothing about it. "Last chance, Thornton," Pike called out. "That barn's just the beginning. Next, we burn the cabin. With all of you inside, is one little girl worth dying for?" Jacob thought of Martha, buried out back, of Samuel, who'd never gotten the chance to grow up, of Catherine, dying by inches in his bed, of Mary, innocent and terrified, clutching a rag doll as her world fell apart. "Yes," he said, loud enough for Pike to hear. "She is." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Jacob used those precious seconds to check his rifle, counting his ammunition. Not enough. Not nearly enough if this turned into a prolonged fight. Behind him, Catherine struggled to sit up, her wedding dress stained with fever sweat, and the blood she'd been coughing up all morning. "Jacob," she gasped. "Come here, please." He moved to her side, keeping one eye on the front door. Catherine's hand found his, and he was shocked by how cold her fingers were, despite the fever burning through her. "I need to tell you about Martha," she whispered. "About why I never came home. Why I let her think I was dead all these years." "Catherine, save your strength." "No," she interrupted with surprising force. "You need to know. After Marcus Whitmore, ... after what he did to me, I was broken, ashamed. I thought I was dirty, ruined. Martha tried to help, tried to convince me to tell the authorities, but I was too scared, too young. So I ran." Tears streaked down her wasted cheeks as the memories poured out. "I lived on the streets for months, nearly starved. That's when I met Henry Wells, Mary's supposed father. He was kind to me, gave me his name, even though he knew the baby wasn't his. But he died of pneumonia before Mary was born, and I've been running ever since." Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Martha never stopped looking for you. Even after we married, she'd ask every traveler if they'd seen a young woman with your description. She loved you, Catherine. She never stopped loving you. And now Mary will have the chance Martha and I never got," Catherine said, her voice growing weaker. "The chance to grow up safe, protected, loved by a good man who knows what family really means." A loud crash from the front porch made them both freeze. Pike had grown tired of waiting and was preparing to break down the door. Jacob could hear him giving orders to his men, positioning them around the cabin. "They're coming in," Jacob said, moving back to his position by the window. Catherine struggled to her feet, swaying dangerously but determined to stand. "Then I'm going to face them on my feet. I won't die cowering in bed like some helpless victim." "Catherine, please. I'm Mrs. Jacob Thornton now," she said with quiet dignity. "And Mrs. Thornton doesn't hide from bullies." The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire cabin. Pike stepped through the doorway, his hand resting on his weapon, his eyes scanning the room with the predatory focus of a wolf. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Look what we have here. The happy couple." His gaze fixed on Catherine, taking in her fevered appearance and weakened state. "You don't look so good, Mrs. Wells. Maybe you should have stayed in bed." "Mrs. Thornton," Catherine corrected, her voice steady despite her obvious pain. "And I'll stand in my own home, thank you kindly." Pike's laugh was ugly. "Your home, lady, in about 10 minutes. This place is going to be nothing but ashes and bad memories." "Where's the girl?" one of Pike's men asked, looking around the cabin with growing suspicion. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. Every second they spent searching was another second for Pastor Henderson to find that letter and get Mary to safety. What girl? Jacob asked. Pike's eyes narrowed dangerously. Don't play games with me, Thornton. We tracked her here, and we know she didn't leave. Where is she? Catherine stepped forward, drawing Pike's attention to herself. You want to know? Where my daughter is. She's somewhere you'll never find her. Somewhere safe from men like you. Lady, you're in no position to make threats. Pike snarled. You're dying anyway. Why make this harder than it has to be? Because, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with each word, some things are worth fighting for. Some things are worth dying for. And my daughter's innocence is one of them. Pike's hand moved to his weapon, and Jacob tensed, ready to act. But Catherine wasn't finished. I know who sent you, she continued, taking another step forward, despite her obvious weakness. I know what Marcus Whitmore did to me 16 years ago, and I know he'll do anything to keep that secret buried. For the first time since entering the cabin, Pike looked uncertain. You're talking nonsense, lady. Mr. Whitmore's a respected businessman. Mr. Whitmore is a monster, Catherine said flatly. And I have proof. The words hung in the air like smoke from the still-burning barn. Pike's eyes darted between Catherine and Jacob, and for a moment, Jacob saw something like fear in the killer's gaze. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone freeze. New riders were coming fast across the prairie, and Jacob could only pray they were friends, not more of Whitmore's men. Because if they were, this was about to become a fight that none of them would survive. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Pike's confidence began to waver for the first time since he'd entered the cabin. His eyes darted toward the window, then back to Catherine, who stood swaying but defiant, despite the fever consuming her from within. What proof? Pike demanded, his voice tight with sudden urgency. You're a dying woman talking nonsense. Nobody's going to believe the ravings of someone with consumption. Catherine's smile was weak but triumphant. Written proof, in Marcus Whitmore's own hand, dated and signed. Threats against my life if I ever told anyone what he did to a 16-year-old girl. Jacob watched Pike's face go pale beneath his weathered skin. For a man who'd built his reputation on cold violence, the killer suddenly looked very much afraid. The kind of fear that came when you realized your employer had lied about the stakes of the job. You're bluffing, Pike said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Catherine took another unsteady step forward, her wedding ring catching the light as she raised her hand. Tell me, Pike, what did Whitmore tell you about me? That I was some gold-digging woman trying to extort money from his family? That I was making up stories about his son? Pike's silence was answer enough. He lied to you, Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger. Just like he's lied to everyone for 16 years. But the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it? Especially when it's written down in black and white. The sound of horses pulling up outside made everyone freeze. Jacob could hear voices, multiple riders, at least 4 or 5 men. Pike gestured sharply to his companions, who moved to flank the windows. Boss, one of Pike's men whispered urgently. That's Sheriff Morrison's voice out there. Jacob's heart leaped with hope. Sheriff Morrison was known throughout the territory as an honest lawman, one of the few who couldn't be bought or intimidated. If he was here, it meant Pastor Henderson had made it to town with Mary and the letter. Pike's jaw tightened as he realized his situation had just become infinitely more complicated. Thornton, he hissed. If you brought the law into this, I didn't have to, Jacob replied. Truth has a way of finding the light all by itself. Sheriff Morrison's voice called out from the yard. Pike, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible, and maybe we can settle this peaceful light. Catherine collapsed back onto the bed, her burst of defiant energy finally exhausted. Jacob moved to her side, supporting her with gentle hands as she struggled to breathe. The fever was winning its battle, and they both knew her time was measured in hours, maybe less. The letter, she whispered urgently. Did they find it? Through the window, Jacob could see Pastor Henderson standing beside Sheriff Morrison, holding a piece of paper that looked yellowed with age. Mary stood close beside the pastor, clutching her rag doll and watching the cabin with frightened eyes. They found it, Jacob said softly. Mary's safe. Tears of relief streamed down Catherine's face. Thank God, she whispered. Thank God Almighty. Pike was pacing now like a caged animal, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. This is impossible, he muttered. Whitmore said all the evidence was destroyed years ago. Apparently not, Jacob said. Apparently he kept a little insurance of his own. Or maybe he just couldn't resist putting his threats in writing. Sheriff Morrison's voice came again, closer to the door this time. Pike, I've got a signed confession here from Marcus Whitmore. Seems he's decided to tell the truth about what happened 16 years ago, rather than face charges for conspiracy to commit harm. You and your boys are done. Come out now, and nobody has to get hurt. Jacob felt a surge of amazement. Whitmore had confessed. The coward had actually admitted his crimes, rather than face the consequences of Pike's actions. Pike's face contorted with rage and betrayal. That lying, cowardly ... He stopped himself, but the damage was done. He'd been abandoned by his employer, left to face the consequences alone. Seems like honor among thieves ain't what it used to be, Jacob observed. Catherine struggled to sit up one more time, her eyes fixed on Pike with burning intensity. You want to know the real tragedy here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of years of pain. That little girl out there is his granddaughter, his own blood, and he was willing to have her eliminated to protect his reputation. Pike stared at her, and for a moment, Jacob saw something almost human flicker in the killer's eyes. Even a man like Pike had to be disturbed by the idea of hurting a child who shared his employer's blood. She's just a baby, Catherine continued, tears flowing freely now. 8 years old, and she's never hurt anybody in her life. All she wants is to belong somewhere, to have a family that won't abandon her. The cabin fell silent except for Catherine's labored breathing and the crackling of the flames, still consuming the barn outside. Pike stood frozen, his hand hovering over his weapon, clearly torn between his professional instincts and the horrible reality of what he'd been hired to do. Pike, Sheriff Morrison called out one final time. You've got 10 seconds to come out, or we're coming in. And I've got 6 deputies with me, all good shots. Pike looked at Catherine, then at Jacob, then toward the window where he could see Mary standing safe beside Pastor Henderson. The little girl was watching the cabin with wide, frightened eyes. But she was alive. She was free. She was protected. She really is his granddaughter, Pike asked quietly. Catherine nodded weakly. She has his eyes. Martha's eyes too, but his bone structure. She's a Whitmore by blood, even if she never carried the name. Pike closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, Jacob saw something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man who'd finally found a line he wouldn't cross. Boys, Pike said to his companions, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Drop your weapons. It's over. Catherine's hand found Jacob's and squeezed with the last of her strength. She's safe, she whispered. My baby girl is safe. Outside, Sheriff Morrison was already moving toward the cabin, and Jacob could hear Mary's voice calling out, Mama, Papa Jacob, are you okay? For the first time in 3 years, Jacob Thornton smiled. Not because the danger was over, but because he'd kept his promise. He'd protected his family. He'd given a dying woman peace and a frightened child hope. And sometimes, in this harsh world, that was enough to call it a victory. Catherine's eyes fluttered closed, but her lips curved in the faintest smile as consciousness finally slipped away, carrying her toward whatever peace awaited those who'd fought the good fight until the very end. Sheriff Morrison's heavy boots echoed across the cabin floor as Pike and his men filed out with their hands raised, their weapons left behind like discarded tools of a trade they'd finally abandoned. Jacob barely noticed them go. His entire focus was on Catherine, who lay pale and still on the bed, her breathing so shallow it barely stirred the quilt covering her. Mama. Mary's voice cut through the silence as she broke free from Pastor Henderson's protective grasp and ran into the cabin. Her small feet pounded across the wooden floor until she reached the bedside, where she climbed up beside her mother. With desperate urgency, I'm here, baby, Catherine whispered, her eyes fluttering open at the sound of her daughter's voice. I'm still here. Jacob stepped back to give them space, his throat tight with emotion as he watched the dying woman gather her child close. Catherine's wedding ring, his wedding ring, caught the morning light as she smoothed Mary's dark hair with trembling fingers. Did you find it? Catherine asked, looking at Pastor Henderson, who still held the yellowed letter in his hands. We found it, Pastor Henderson confirmed, his voice heavy with the weight of what he'd read. Every word Marcus Whitmore wrote to you, every threat, every admission of guilt. Sheriff Morrison says it's enough to put him away for the rest of his life. Catherine closed her eyes with profound relief. Then she's truly safe. No one can ever hurt her for being born. No one can call her illegitimate or unwanted ever again. Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands out of respect for the scene before him. He was a good man. Jacob knew one of the few lawmen in the territory who couldn't be bought or intimidated. His presence meant justice would be served. Mrs. Thornton, the sheriff said gently, using Catherine's married name with deliberate respect, I want you to know that Pike and his men are in custody. Marcus Whitmore's confession means you and your daughter are completely safe now. He'll never be able to threaten you again. Catherine nodded weakly, then turned her attention back to Mary, who was curled against her side like a small animal seeking warmth. Sweetheart, I need to tell you some things. Important things you need to remember when I'm not here anymore. Don't talk like that, Mama, Mary said, her voice muffled against Catherine's shoulder. You're going to get better. Papa Jacob will take care of you, and you'll get strong again. Jacob's heart broke at the child's desperate hope. He could see what Mary couldn't, that Catherine's skin had taken on the waxy pallor that came in the final hours, that her breathing was becoming more labored with each passing minute. The consumption had won its battle, and there was nothing any of them could do to change that outcome. Mary Elizabeth Thornton, Catherine said, lifting her daughter's chin so she could look into her eyes. That's your name now. Your real name, given to you by a good man who promised to protect you. Do you understand what that means? Mary nodded solemnly, though tears were streaming down her cheeks. It means you belong somewhere, Catherine continued, her voice growing weaker, but more urgent. It means you have a papa who will love you and teach you right from wrong. It means you're not alone in this world, no matter what happens to me. Jacob moved closer to the bed, kneeling beside it, so he was at Mary's eye level. Your mama's right, sweetheart. You're my daughter now, legal and proper. And I promise you, on my honor as a Christian man, that I will love you and protect you for as long as there's breath in my body. Mary looked between her dying mother and the man who'd become her father in the space of a few hours, trying to process changes too big for an 8-year-old mind to fully comprehend. Will you tell me stories about Mama when she's gone, so I don't forget her? Jacob's voice cracked as he answered. Every night, if you want. I'll tell you about how brave she was, how much she loved you, how she fought to keep you safe even when she was sick. Catherine reached out and took Jacob's hand, intertwining their fingers. There's something else, Mary. Something wonderful I just found out today. Your new papa was married to my sister Martha. That means you're not just getting a father, you're coming home to family. Real family. Mary's eyes widened with wonder despite her grief. Aunt Martha. The one in the stories you used to tell me. The very same, Catherine said, smiling through her pain. She would have loved you so much, sweetheart. Just like your papa Jacob loves you now. Pastor Henderson stepped forward, his Bible open in his hands. Catherine, would you like me to say a prayer? For you, for Mary, for the family God has brought together in this impossible time. Catherine nodded gratefully. Please. Pastor Henderson's voice filled the cabin with words of comfort and hope. Heavenly Father, we come before you in this moment of joy and sorrow intertwined. We thank you for bringing this family together, for providing protection for the innocent, and for showing us that even in our darkest hours, your love can shine through human kindness. Mary buried her face against her mother's shoulder, and Jacob could feel her small body shaking with sobs she was trying to hold back. Catherine stroked her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness, each touch a blessing and a goodbye. Lord, Pastor Henderson continued, we pray for Catherine, who has fought so bravely to protect her child. Grant her peace in these final hours, knowing that her daughter will be loved and cherished. And we pray for Mary, that she will grow up knowing how deeply she was wanted, how fiercely she was protected, and how completely she belongs in this family you have created. Amen, Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. Amen, Jacob echoed, his own eyes filled with tears. As the prayer ended, Catherine turned her face toward Mary one last time. I want you to remember something, baby girl. Every time you look at the stars, every time you see a sunrise, every time you feel loved and safe, that's me watching over you, not as a ghost or a spirit, but as a mother's love that never dies, never fades, never leaves you alone. She looked at Jacob with profound gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for giving her your name, for giving her a future, for being the man I knew you were the moment I saw you. Jacob leaned closer, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for trusting me with her. I swear to you, Catherine Thornton, I will be the father she deserves. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying away the last of the smoke from the burned barn. The danger was over, the threats neutralized, the future secured. But in the quiet cabin, a little girl was learning the hardest lesson life could teach, that love sometimes meant letting go, and that goodbye was just another word for the love that would last forever. Catherine's eyes fluttered closed one final time, her hand still holding Jacob's, her other arm wrapped protectively around her daughter. In her final moments, she wasn't alone. She wasn't afraid. She was surrounded by family, held by love, and comforted by the knowledge that her sacrifice had given her child everything she'd never had: a name, a home, and a father who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. And in that moment, Catherine Elizabeth Thornton smiled, knowing that her daughter would never have to run again. 6 months later, the Colorado Territory had witnessed one of the coldest winters in living memory. But spring was finally breaking across the prairie with the promise of new beginnings. Mary Elizabeth Thornton stood by the 3 graves behind the cabin, Martha, Samuel, and Catherine each, marked with a wooden cross that Jacob had carved with his own hands. In her arms, she carried wildflowers she'd picked from the meadow where the old barn used to stand. "Good morning, Mama Catherine," she said softly, placing purple lupins on the newest grave. "Papa Jacob says you would have loved to see the flowers this year. They're the prettiest we've ever had." Jacob watched from the porch, his heart still catching every time he heard her call him Papa. At 9 years old now, Mary had grown taller and stronger, but she still carried that old rag doll everywhere, the last connection to the frightened little girl who'd arrived in a broken wagon all those months ago. "Papa Jacob," she called out, turning toward him with a brightness that had taken months to return to her eyes. "Come, see what I found by Aunt Martha's grave." Jacob walked over to find a small wooden cross that had fallen during the last storm. He knelt beside Mary to examine it, and she slipped her small hand into his calloused one, with the natural ease of a daughter who'd never known a day without her father's protection. "I've been thinking," Mary said seriously, "about what Pastor Henderson said in church last Sunday, about how God can bring good things out of sad things." "What kind of good things?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. "Well," Mary said, settling cross-legged in the grass beside Catherine's grave, "Mama Catherine died, which was the saddest thing ever. But because she died, I got you for a papa. And you were so lonely before we came, and now you're not lonely anymore. So maybe God knew we needed each other." Jacob's throat tightened with emotion. In the months since Catherine's death, he'd watched Mary grapple with loss in the way only children could, with brutal honesty, infinite hope, and a wisdom that humbled him daily. "I think you might be right about that, sweetheart," he said. Mary was quiet for a moment, tracing patterns in the dirt with her finger. "Do you miss Aunt Martha and Samuel terribly much, even though you have me now?" It was a question she'd asked before, in different ways, and Jacob always answered with the same careful honesty. "I miss them every day. But missing someone doesn't mean you can't love someone new. The heart's got room for all kinds of love, Mary. It doesn't run out. Like how I miss Mama Catherine, but I love you too." Exactly like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind rustle through the new grass. Jacob had rebuilt the barn over the winter, and the smell of fresh lumber, mixed with the scent of prairie flowers, created something that felt like hope made manifest. "Papa Jacob," Mary said eventually, "I want to tell you something important. I'm listening. Yesterday at school, Tommy Morrison said I wasn't really your daughter, because I don't look like you. He said I was just some orphan you took in out of pity." Mary's voice was matter-of-fact, but Jacob could hear the hurt underneath. Jacob felt a familiar surge of protective anger, but he kept his voice calm. "What did you say to Tommy?" Mary's chin lifted with pride. "I said Mary Elizabeth Thornton is my real name, written down legal in the courthouse, and you're my real papa because you chose to be. I said blood doesn't make a family, love does. And then I told him my mama was the bravest woman who ever lived, and she married the most honorable man in the territory to make sure I'd always be safe." Jacob had to clear his throat before he could speak. "That was exactly the right thing to say, I know," Mary said with simple confidence. "Because it's the truth." They walked back toward the cabin together, Mary chattering about her school lessons and the new dress Mrs. Henderson was making her for the church social next month. Jacob listened with the kind of attention he'd once reserved for the sound of approaching danger, but now devoted to the everyday miracle of a child who felt safe enough to dream about the future. Inside the cabin, the afternoon light streamed through windows that Mary had insisted on decorating with pressed flowers. The space that had once felt like a tomb filled with ghosts now buzzed with the energy of a growing girl book scattered on the table, half-finished drawings tacked to the walls, a doll's dress hanging on a makeshift clothesline. "Papa," Mary said, settling at the kitchen table with her slate for homework, "do you think Mama Catherine knows how good I'm getting at reading?" Jacob paused in his preparation of their evening meal. It was a question that touched on the boundaries of faith and hope, the kind of theological territory that required careful navigation. "I think," he said slowly, "that a mother's love doesn't end just because she's not here anymore. I think the love your mama had for you is part of who you are now, and it will be with you always. Whether she knows specific things or not, her love for you continues." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Because sometimes, when I'm reading really well, I feel warm inside, like someone's proud of me. Someone is proud of you, Jacob said. I'm proud of you every single day. As evening approached, they sat together on the porch while Mary practiced her letters and Jacob whittled a new toy horse. The routine had become precious to him these quiet hours, when the day's work was done and they could simply be a family. Papa. Jacob, Mary said, looking up from her slate. Mrs. Henderson asked me today if I remember my life before I came here. If I miss it, what did you tell her? I told her that before feels like a bad dream. I woke up from like I was lost in the dark for a long time, and then I found home. She paused, her expression serious beyond her years. I told her that sometimes the best things come after the worst things, and you just have to be brave enough to keep going until you find them. Jacob set down his whittling and looked at this remarkable child, who'd somehow found wisdom in the depths of loss. You know what, Mary Elizabeth? What? Your mama was right about one thing. You are going to grow up to be an extraordinary woman. Mary beamed at the compliment, then returned to her letters with renewed focus. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Jacob felt something he'd thought was lost forever: contentment. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of peace alongside it. That night, as he tucked Mary into bed and listened to her prayers, God bless Papa Jacob, and God bless Mama Catherine in heaven, and help me to be good and brave tomorrow. Jacob reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. He'd thought his story was over. When Martha and Samuel died, he'd believed that love was a finite resource, that loss meant emptiness, that a broken heart could never be whole again. But Mary had taught him that healing didn't mean forgetting it, meant making room for new love alongside the old. Standing in the doorway watching her sleep, clutching that worn rag doll that had traveled so many miles to find safety, Jacob whispered a prayer of his own. Thank you, Lord, for second chances, for showing me that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the hardest trials. And thank you for Catherine, who was brave enough to trust a stranger with her most precious gift. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of new grass and wild roses. The barn stood rebuilt and strong. The graves in the backyard held their peaceful watch, and inside the cabin, a little girl who'd once had nothing but a name worth fighting for, now slept safe in the knowledge that she belonged to someone who would never let her go. Sometimes love isn't about finding your perfect match. Sometimes it's about finding the person who needs exactly what you have to give, and discovering that in the giving, you receive more than you ever thought possible. Sometimes the greatest gift you can offer isn't romance or passion, but simply the promise that no matter what storms come, you'll weather them together. And sometimes, when life has taken everything you thought mattered, it hands you something you never knew you needed. The chance to be exactly who someone else needs you to be. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, but inside the cabin, all was peace. Mary Elizabeth Thornton was home. As we close this story of sacrifice and redemption, we're reminded that sometimes the most profound acts of love aren't grand gestures or passionate declarations. They're quiet promises kept in the darkest hours. Jacob Thornton didn't just give Catherine Wells his name. He gave Mary Elizabeth a future where she could walk with her head held high, knowing she belonged to someone who chose her not out of obligation, but out of love. In a world that often shows no mercy to the vulnerable, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, "Not on my watch." But what about you? Have you ever witnessed someone make a sacrifice that changed everything? Have you seen love triumph over fear, hope overcome despair, or ordinary people do extraordinary things to protect the innocent? In your own life, who has been your Jacob Thornton? The person who gave you safety when the world felt dangerous, who offered you belonging when you felt lost. Share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories of human courage and compassion remind us that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope for redemption, always a chance for love to write a better ending. If this story of sacrifice and redemption touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell so you never miss another powerful tale of faith, courage, and the triumph of love over adversity. And make sure to check out the video appearing right here on your screen titled "Lumberjack Lived Alone for 15 Years. Then 3 knocks changed everything" for another unforgettable Western story that will remind you of the incredible power of human kindness to transform even the most broken hearts. Until next time, remember, in this harsh world, sometimes the greatest strength comes from choosing to protect those who can't protect themselves. God bless, and we'll see you in the next story.